Hey everyone, and welcome back to another news alert. My name is Jimmy Boyd, and thank you so much for tuning into Boyd News. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more updates like this. And feel free to support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Links are in the description below the video. Alright, well, great to see all of you again. I hope your weekend went well. If some of you did not notice, I decided to extend my weekend a bit and take a break from the news. With this break, I was able to make some changes to the channel that I hope you all like visually. We will have several transitioning scenes now to display the news, and please let me know down in the comments how you like the new overlays. So big news coming out from Ukraine today. We're going to start with a report coming out from the United States as mainstream news outlet Politico is reporting today that immense pressure has been applied on the Ukrainians to accept a peace deal with Russia. And it comes at a huge cost to Ukraine, and I could see many of you expecting to hear this from a mile away. Here's that new report for you on your screen. It says Ukraine pressured to leave the Donbas. The United States has continued to insist in talks on a potential agreement to end the war that Ukraine should agree to withdraw from the Donetsk Oblast without a fight. So yeah, that's what's being reported today on mainstream news, that it looks like the shift of focus now is back onto Ukraine. And the major deadlock is obviously territorial issues. We know that Ukraine does not want to give up the Donbas. So it looks like U.S. officials are now starting to put immense pressure onto Ukraine to force them to give up the Donbas. So that way we can hopefully see an end to this war, because we know that's a demand coming from the Russian side that the Russians will not bend on in any way. So huge news today. We'll talk more about this story in just a minute. Other top headline news: Zelensky has headed to the UK today to hold talks with UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and French President Emmanuel Macron. According to reports, he is there to discuss security guarantees for Ukraine and the current deadlock in negotiations. Aside from this news, we have two big stories out of Ukraine and Russia today regarding aviation pilots. Accidents have been reported on both sides that have resulted in the loss of life to pilots of fighter jets. Those are big news. Also, we'll be covering that as we move forward, and obviously lots of other news to unpack in this video. Let's go ahead and jump right into this. We'll hop it over here to X with Nexta. It says the U.S. is looking for any way to push Ukraine towards compromise. According to France 24, Washington is ramping up pressure on Zelensky, pushing him to sign a peace deal as soon as possible, but Ukraine cannot agree to anything without working through the details. The main obstacle remains unchanged: territory. According to a source, Putin will not sign any agreement without concessions on the Donbas, while Kyiv has no intention of handing over its land to an autocrat. Zelensky is in London today, meeting with the UK Prime Minister, Germany's Chancellor, and France's President. Leaders are discussing the state of negotiations and likely searching for a way out of the deadlock. Earlier today, Donald Trump accused Zelensky of allegedly not even reading the American plan to end the war. Yeah, Trump was pretty much calling on Zelensky and saying he was disappointed in him. This was stated in the last 24 hours. I'll show you guys the actual statement here in just a minute. It says here, Zelensky to meet NATO EU chiefs amid mounting U.S. pressure for a peace deal. So it looks like they're trying to figure out, how they're going to respond to this. The Americans are obviously pressuring Ukraine right now to end this war. So they obviously need security guarantees, and they need to figure out how they're going to resolve the territorial issues inside of Ukraine. Is Ukraine going to give up the Donbas? Maybe they're looking for huge security guarantees. So, maybe if they do decide to give up the Donbas, they want to make sure that Russia does not restart the war and attack them again. Because we've discussed this many times, that in the Donbas, particularly in the Donetsk region in southeastern Ukraine, there's heavy fortifications that have been built over there, and that's why Ukraine also doesn't want to give up that territory, because it will prevent the Russians from attacking deeper into Ukraine. So clearly they want to get some major security guarantees if they're going to even think about doing that. But we've heard so many times coming out from Zelensky, him claiming that they will never give up the Donbas or cede any territory over to Russia. So it's going to get very interesting to see how this all plays out. Now from Bliskovka, the U.S. is looking for a way to get Ukraine to leave the Donbas one way or another, reports Politico. Washington insists that Kyiv must leave the Donbas, according to a senior EU official. He said that the U.S. position is simple. Russia demands that Ukraine give up the territories, and the Americans are constantly thinking about how to achieve this. Ukraine, however, insists on a ceasefire along the front line because, according to Kyiv, leaving the Donbas will only encourage Putin to make new conquests. So here's a report what the U.S. wants from Ukraine: leave Donbas or a one way or another. Kyiv keeps insisting war should be frozen along the current front lines. So we've been seeing from Ukraine for a long time now calling for a ceasefire with Russia. Russia does not agree to that. So this is what it really boils down to now is now that we've got the U.S. putting pressure onto Kyiv, are they going to give up the Donbas? Are they not going to? And if not, how are they going to continue these negotiations? What do you guys think is going to happen next? You can let me know down in the comments, but it looks like Ukraine has to make a very serious decision, and it looks like the U.S. is really forcing them to make this decision in a very short amount of time as well. We just heard recently that Trump was giving both sides until Thanksgiving, but now apparently that is no longer the thing. Obviously, it's past Thanksgiving now, but we know how the Trump administration works. They're going to put a lot of pressure onto Ukraine to try to get some sort of deal here soon. So very interesting. Now moving on to the military news UA. Zelensky has not yet seen the new amendments to the peace plan due to the risk of wiretapping. The Secretary of National Security and Defense Council, Umarov, will personally bring them from the United States and explain the details of the negotiations, a source told RBC Ukraine. In particular, the issues of territories remains one of the most difficult. During the discussion of the draft peace plan, initially the peace plan had 28 points, then in Geneva they reduced it to 20. Then after negotiations in Moscow, there were further changes that our delegation saw in Florida and discussed with the Americans. Okay, so it looks like it's very difficult right now. Obviously, the original peace plan was presented to Ukraine, and that's when Europe and Ukrainian officials met with the U.S., made some amendments, dropped it down from 28 points down to 20. And then whenever the U.S. met with Russia last week, now apparently there's been more changes. So now we're back to square one where we got to start, tweaking a lot of these details to this peace plan again. Okay, so it looks like we're still a very far away, a long ways away until we get some sort of settlement between Russia and Ukraine. But apparently there's more issues now due to the Russians making some amendments on their end when the U.S. met them in Moscow last week. Now, Kyiv Post, Donald Trump criticized President Zelensky, saying he was a little disappointed that Zelensky hadn't yet read Washington's proposal. After U.S.-Ukraine talks in Miami ended with no agreement on security guarantees, territory, or fears the plan favors Russia. And this is what Trump said right here. It says, "We spoke with President Putin and we spoke with Ukrainian leaders, including President Zelensky. And I have to say that I'm a little disappointed that President Zelensky has not yet read the proposal," Trump said. Yeah, so apparently the reason why Zelensky hasn't read this yet is because they're worried about wiretapping. They don't want this plan to be leaked out to the public, that Zelensky wants to read it personally. So we're hearing that Rustem Umerov, the National Security Defense Council secretary, who was in the U.S. last week for 3 days, meeting with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, he'll be giving that plan directly over to Zelensky, probably sometime this week. Then he'll review it. Maybe by the end of the week, we'll hear something coming out from Zelensky after he takes a look at that document. Now, from next to breaking, European leaders arrive in London. Starmer warmly welcomes Merz, Macron, and Zelensky. European leaders have arrived in London, where Keir Starmer gave an especially warm welcome to Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron, and Volodymyr Zelensky. Together, they will discuss the situation in Ukraine and the state of U.S.-mediated negotiations. Washington proposed a ceasefire last month, one that incorporated many of Russia's wartime demands. U.S. President Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner brought a revised version to Moscow last week, then held several days of follow-up talks with Ukrainian officials in Miami. Those discussions ended on Saturday without a breakthrough. Zelensky described the talks as constructive but difficult. This was just a little video of Keir Starmer welcoming French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and then we have Zelensky showing up today also, as I mentioned earlier, for these talks. And what we're hearing is there's no breakthrough in the negotiations between the U.S. and Ukraine right now after they met last week. Okay, so moving on. Max 25, Starmer said that Ukrainian issue is Ukraine's business and that today's talks are at a critical stage in the fight for peace. Zelensky added, "Today is very important. Unity between Europe, Ukraine, and the U.S. Macron stressed the Russian economy is starting to suffer, especially after our latest sanctions." Then Merz said he was skeptical about some of the details in the documents coming from the U.S., but added this was why the leaders had gathered today. "This could be a decisive moment for all of us, so we are trying to continue to support Ukraine. The fate of this country, Ukraine, is the fate of Europe," the chancellor said. So clearly some major negotiations going on between these four. We got Emmanuel Macron, Friedrich Merz, and Keir Starmer here meeting with Zelensky today to discuss this peace deal and working out security guarantees and how they're going to move forward with this negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine. Now, from Max 25, the talks in London focused on security guarantees and the reconstruction of Ukraine. This was a report coming out from the Elysee Palace, and it says it was also noted that today's meeting also allowed for the continuation of work on the U.S. peace plan. Okay, that was just a statement coming out directly from the Elysee Palace today, and this is coming out from London, where Zelensky met with the other European leaders. Okay, so just a statement coming out from them today. Now, Vicegrad 24, Zelensky says territorial issues and security guarantees remain unresolved after 3-day talks with the U.S. in Miami. In an interview with Bloomberg, Ukrainian President said negotiations stalled over territorial questions. This was him, by the way, in an interview while he was in the UK today. And he says, there is a vision from the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine, but we don't have a shared view on the Donbas, Zelensky said. Ukraine also insists on a separate security guarantees agreement with Western allies, primarily the U.S. There is one question that I and all Ukrainians want answered. If Russia starts a war again, what will our partners do? He added. So we can see where Zelensky stands right now. Is he thinking about giving up the Donbas? Maybe in some ways he is. But they want firm security guarantees, I would assume, if they're going to do that. Because again, if Russia just bypasses these major fortifications in the Donetsk region, this will allow them to strike deeper into Ukraine if they want to restart the war. So Zelensky's got a very tough decision to make here. If they are going to give up the Donbas, he wants firm security guarantees, not only from European partners, but also from the United States, and especially them, because they'd be able to prevent any kind of attack in the future if the U.S. would come to their aid. So that's going to be very difficult for them to resolve that. Let me know what you think on his statement today. All right, now from World Source News, breaking Politico reports, officials from Europe remain uncertain if the United States will act as a mediator or lean towards the Russians, while adding that Kyiv has yet to receive details on the protections against threats that Washington intends to extend. Okay, so what we're hearing from officials from Europe, they're concerned that the U.S. is going to start leaning towards Russia and obviously siding with the Russians again. We've kind of been seeing this already. And they're concerned that maybe the U.S. is not going to be only acting as a mediator. They're actually just going to completely side with the Russians, push Ukraine aside, and try to force this peace deal that's obviously going to benefit Russia much more than Ukraine. Thought that was interesting. Politico was also reporting this today, so let me know your thoughts on that one. Now, Max 25, Merz and Macron quickly left the British Prime Minister's residence, where they met with Starmer and Zelensky. According to Sky News, all four declined to answer journalist questions. So apparently this meeting ended very quickly and everybody just kind of dispersed, is what we're hearing. There was no press conference or anything like that being held. There was no questions being answered by the press. Everybody just kind of took off. So it looks like they are trying to keep things a secret for right now and try to keep these negotiations behind closed doors as they try to resolve, how they're going to move forward with this peace settlement with Russia. Now, Max 25, Putin has enough money for another 18 months of war against Ukraine, according to Bild magazine. That's going to be directly out of Germany. The Russians believe that they still have time and that the negotiations can be dragged out further. Putin insists on extremely far-reaching demands, which he is not going to give up. So this makes sense right here with this kind of report coming out on why Russia is not so concerned about stopping this war. Apparently, Putin believes he's got another 18 months of financing for this war. Okay, they're not going anywhere. They're going to continue the fighting inside of Ukraine. Putin also came out, I think it was last week during a conference, he was stating that that Ukraine will be forced to leave the Donbas one way or another, that whether that's done through a peace deal or they will achieve it through military means. But obviously the Russians are not moving extremely quickly, so how long is it going to take them to take over the entirety of the Donbas? That includes the Donetsk region and the Luhansk region. But interesting story today from Germany. Let me know how you think on that. Now, from Ozen Defender, according to channels affiliated with the Russian Air Force, an incident occurred yesterday at an unidentified airbase in Russia, which involved the accidental aviation of both ejector seats and a tactical strike bomber, likely an Su-24 or 34, while the aircraft was parked inside a hardened aircraft shelter, resulting in the death of the pilot and navigator of the Su-24 and 34. Okay, so here's the report from Fighter Bomber. This is going to be a Russian Telegram channel. It says, yesterday in one of the bomber aviation regiments, the ejection system activated on an aircraft that was in a shelter. The pilot and navigator sustained injuries that were incompatible with life. State Commission is working at the scene. Okay, so allegedly what happened here is this Su-24 or 34 fighter bomber was parked inside of a hangar that had an enclosed shelter. And apparently, the ejection seat went off unexpectedly, launching the two pilots into the air, obviously striking the ceiling and killing both of them. So I thought that was crazy. I've never heard of anything like this before. But haven't we been seeing a lot of fighter jets on the Russian side? Sometimes they're crashing, and these pilots are not ejecting. So I wonder if they have a lot of issues trying to maintain some of these systems, like these ejection seats, and that's why we're seeing this happening. So this is more show like sanctions onto Russia's aviation industry. They're having a hard time maintaining a lot of their fleets, especially even in the military over here. We continue to hear problems with their ejection systems, and this one, in this case, killing the two pilots when it went off inside of an enclosed garage. So crazy news. Now, Bliskovka, today at noon in the eastern direction during a combat mission, the pilot of the Su-27 aircraft, Yevgeny Ivanov, died. According to the Air Force, Yevgeny was a lieutenant colonel, senior navigator of the 39th Tactical Aviation Brigade. The circumstances of the tragedy are being investigated. So we had a senior pilot that was flying an Su-27 of the Ukrainian Air Force. So apparently today, that aircraft has either crashed. I'm not sure if it was shot down. I haven't seen the Russians claiming that they shot it down or anything like that. But looks like we had some sort of accident where this plane potentially crashed, and we had this aircraft pilot, Yevgeny Ivanov, who had died in this incident. So very sad news to report this coming out from Ukraine today. It's been a little while since we've heard of any incidents with some of these aircraft, but in this case, an Su-27, we had a pilot that lost his life today. Now, Vicegrad 24 breaking. Ukraine launches another drone swarm attack on Russia. The airports in Volgograd, Saratov, Penza, and Tambov have been forced to shut down operations. Okay, so we had a pretty large drone attack onto Russia overnight. You can see these drones kind of going everywhere. And then these little orange airplanes are the airports that were shutting down due to these flights of drones going into Russia. And I do have some information on some things that were being struck today. Let's go ahead and take a look at this now from Max 25. A number of enemy facilities were hit, according to the General Staff. Luhansk region in the Chemrivka area. An ammunition depot was hit in the area of temporarily occupied Donetsk. UAV depot of the Russian occupiers was hit. A fuel depot of an enemy unit in the Semekoye area of the Luhansk region, that's in Ukraine, was hit. Mobile fire group and the Panzer S-1 anti-aircraft missile system were hit in the Donetsk region. Results of the hit on December 5th, 2025 by strike UAVs of the Temryuk seaport Krasnodar Krai. The destruction of 20 tanks, which is 70% of the total, has been confirmed. In addition, the fire continues on the liquefied gas loading platform, where about 24 railway tanks were located. As of the evening of December 7th, the total area of the fire was almost 1,000 square meters. Okay, so this report right here, what we're looking at with this picture, is going to be the strike on the Temryuk port. Okay, we talked about this, a seaport that exports Russian liquefied natural gas out of the Krasnodar Krai region near the Sea of Azov. It came under attack last week and was completely destroyed, is what we're hearing. So about 70% of the tanks over there have been destroyed. So that's massive news. And we know that Russia's doing a lot of that inside of Ukraine, destroying their natural gas facilities, their energy sites. So this is Ukraine responding in the same exact way as the Russians are, trying to destroy their critical infrastructure. We can see a lot of other different targets were hit here. We had anti-aircraft systems that were attacked, fuel depot, ammo depot, lots of different things hit inside of Russia overnight. Unfortunately, though, no videos coming out or pictures showing any of these strikes today. Just this one most likely on that seaport of Temryuk. Now, Bliskovka, Russia is preparing attempts to destabilize Ukraine under the guise of peaceful protests, said Ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets. Russia's special services are planning a series of actions under the code name against the war in Odessa, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Kyiv. The goal is to destabilize the situation inside the country and divert attention from the front. Okay, so get ready for more protests to break out inside of Ukraine. According to Ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets, he's saying that the Russians are trying to attempt to destabilize Ukraine, and they're calling it under the guise of peaceful protests. Okay, so expect to start seeing some of that inside of Ukraine, and there's going to be more pressure being put onto the government, as we know right now. As I just reported to you guys at the start of this video, Ukraine's under heavy pressure from the U.S. to accept an unfavorable settlement to end this war and benefit Russia. for Russia to gain the Donbass. So looks like that's another tactic coming from the Russians here soon. Now, Anton Gerashenko, Russia is in discussions with India to localize production of Russian drones such as Lancet and Garan. Sergei Chemezov, head of Rostec Corporation, said, India, are very interested in our Lancet drones and in all our drones in general. They are also ready to produce them. We have talked with them and are now discussing the possibility of localizing production in India at Indian enterprises, he said. Also, according to Russian military blogger Wargonzo, on December 5th, delegation of the Smolensk FPV drone piloting center arrived in India to complete objectives within the framework of the Russian-Indian strategic partnership. So what was it, just in the last week or two, we had Putin showing up in India to meet with Narendra Modi, the prime minister over there. Looks like they have struck some sort of deal, because this information was actually coming out over the weekend that allegedly the Indians are going to start producing drones for Russia. That will obviously at some point start to be used inside of Ukraine. So this reminds me a lot of like the North Koreans. The North Koreans have been sending a lot of military equipment over to Russia to help them out. Now possibly the Indians are going to start producing Lancet strike drones for Russia. And obviously those could start being deployed inside of Ukraine. So not good news to hear about this. We're seeing a lot of expansion between partners with India, Russia, China, North Korea that is continuing to expand at this time. All right, and here's another similar report from War Translated. It says Bloomberg reports that a Russian liquefied natural gas export plant has delivered its first shipment to China since U.S. sanctions were imposed in January. This is another sign of deepening energy cooperation between Beijing and Moscow. According to the outlet, the vessel Valera, which loaded a cargo in October from Gazprom's Portovaya facility in the Baltic Sea, arrived at the Beihai import terminal in southern China on Monday. Okay, so that should have been today when this took place. So very interesting. Russia's not supposed to be selling any liquefied natural gas over to China, and apparently they found a way to do that. We've been seeing this a lot. That Russia's still selling oil over to China and India. India found some ways to get some oil directly from Russia through some unsanctioned companies. Now we're starting to see this with China. They're starting to purchase liquefied natural gas directly from Russia. Okay, and now if you notice here, it talks about this port near the Baltic Sea that's probably up near Ust-Luga is what I'm thinking. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see Ukraine launching an attack over there again very soon. It's been a while since they've attacked the port of Ust-Luga. There was an attack probably about 3 to 4 months ago, I want to say, on the Primorsk port, which is major oil export port over there. That came under attack, so I wouldn't be surprised we see another strike over here in this area very soon. Ukraine's probably going to launch some drones trying to shut down this operation for the Russians. Now for next, gasoline in Russia now costs more than in the United States. The difference is already about 8%, something not seen since 2021. In the U.S., fuel prices are falling due to declining oil prices, which make up nearly half of the cost of gasoline. In Russia, it's the opposite. Prices are rising faster than inflation, even though crude oil accounts for no more than 10% of production costs. The main part of the price comes from taxes and fees, which make up as much as 60%. Well, we have been seeing that Russia's starting to raise a lot of taxes on the citizens over there, driving up the cost of goods, and in this case, also oil. Gasoline prices are rising over there and still on the rise. Looks like they've come down recently, but still much higher than, back towards even the early starts of the 2000s. So gas prices still extremely high inside of Russia. This is going to be hurting their economy even further and also causing more inflation over there. And many people are going to be suffering, as we know that taxes are being raised on pretty much all the citizens starting in 2026. They have a major VAT tax that's going to put taxes on all products being sold inside of Russia. And this is more show that Russia's doing whatever they can to keep the funding for the war in Ukraine. And in the end, what it's really doing is hurting the citizens' wallet inside of Russia. Now, from next, Politico reports that the European Commission is proposing to split financial guarantees among EU member states to provide Ukraine with a reparations loan funded by frozen Russian assets. These guarantees are needed to persuade Belgium to confiscate 185 billion euros held in Euroclear. Another 25 billion is scattered across the bloc in private bank accounts. Okay, so we've been hearing recently that Belgium is trying to block the EU from allowing these frozen Russian asset funds to go over to Ukraine. They're concerned about having to repay it, right? So apparently, a lot of these nations are coming together and they're stating that, hey, we'll put up a certain amount of security guarantee for this. If there's anything that happens, apparently they're willing to fork up the money to allow this money to go over to Ukraine. Here's a report from Politico. Here's how EU capitals would divvy up Ukraine loan backstop under 210 billion euros frozen Russian asset plan. Okay, so yeah, so we keep hearing about this. It looks like Europe is trying to do whatever they can to figure out a way to get this over to Ukraine. And there's obviously a lot of concerns about, backlash from Russia. What is Russia going to do if they try to give this over to Ukraine? Because these are frozen Russian assets that were taken at the start of the war, and they're still trying to figure out a way to do this. I think in the next week or two, we should be hearing whether this money is going to be going to Ukraine, but the EU is not stopping at all, trying to figure out a way to do this, even with trying to come up with all this money from these different nations as a loan backstop in case something goes wrong here. So huge news there. And if you notice, Germany alone is going to be forking up 51.3 billion as a backstop for this loan. Crazy amounts of money. Now for Vicegrad 24, France refuses to tell the EU which banks hold 18 billion euros of frozen Russian assets. European Commission plans to use 25 billion euros of frozen assets for a reparations loan to Ukraine. France holds the second largest portion of frozen Bank of Russia assets, but it's not revealed to EU colleagues which banks hold the funds. Most of these funds are in French and Belgian banks, 18 billion euros in France, 7 billion euros in Belgium, and smaller amounts in Germany and Cyprus. So it looks like we can't only blame Belgium for trying to block this. It looks like France is now refusing to tell the EU which banks hold 18 billion euros of these frozen Russian assets. So makes you wonder, do some of these nations want to keep this money for themselves? Why do they not want to hand them over to Ukraine? We know France is a huge supporter of Ukraine, so why would they be blocking this? But apparently it's not only Belgium, but now France is starting to hold things up. I think it's going to take some time for the EU to try to figure out how to get these funds over to Ukraine, and it actually may not happen at all. You guys can let me know what you think on this story here. Now from NOLA reports, U.S. Congress leaders have approved a defense budget that includes $800 million for Ukraine over 2 years, with $400 million allocated for 2026 and the same for 2027, aimed at extending and expanding military aid. The bill also calls for a review of Russia's military strategy and deployments, including their impact on the Indo-Pacific region. Here's a report from The Hill. Read full text of the National Defense Authorization Act. This was coming out yesterday. Okay, so we're hearing that apparently the U.S. Congress has approved this defense budget for Ukraine. That's going to include $400 million per year for this year, coming up in 2026, and then next year following in 2027. Okay, so if you think about that, only $400 million for Ukraine is basically nothing. That's a drop in the bucket for this size of this war. So this really shows right here that Europe is going to have to back Ukraine or continue to back them 100%, as the U.S. is basically doing nothing to help them out other than providing the PURL initiative for NATO to buy weapons from the U.S. to sell over to Ukraine. So crazy news there. Now, Bliskovka, Ukrainian units have stabilized the front line in the Pokrovsk direction, according to Suspilne. Ukrainian forces conducted maneuvers in the areas of Lysivka and Suky Yar to avoid potential encirclement and take up more advantageous positions. The operation was prepared in advance and took place some time ago, according to a source in the defense forces. Okay, so what we're hearing in the Pokrovsk direction down in the Donetsk region, since we're talking about the Donbas and all that, apparently Ukraine is still fighting over here around Pokrovsk, and they've taken up some advantageous positions, and they've stabilized the front line over here in this direction. That's what we're hearing. So even though the Russians claim that they have control over the city of Pokrovsk, apparently that's still being refuted by Ukraine's military, claiming they've made some advancements over here, taken up some better positions, and stopped the Russians from taking over the city. So we'll wait for more details on that, but it still looks like Ukraine is fighting hard in the Pokrovsk direction. All right, now for Max 25, Ukrainian air defense shot down or suppressed 131 out of 149 drones. It's a lot of drones going into Ukraine overnight, almost 150, but 131 of those being taken out. We've been seeing really good numbers coming out from Ukraine's air defense teams. I think we did have some drone strikes in the Cherniv region up in the northern side of Ukraine today, being reported. Some residential areas were hit over there. Aside from that, not too much information. And as we can see, a lot of these drones were destroyed, which is why we're not hearing of too much damage inside of Ukraine today. Now for the Kyiv Independent, these are the indicative estimates of Russia's combat losses as of December 8th, according to the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In our final update here, Russia's losses as of December 8th, 810 troops, 1 AFV, 47 vehicles and fuel tanks, 2 tanks, 10 artillery systems, 530 UAVs, 2 MLRS, 4 cruise missiles, and 3 special equipment. Okay, so not a whole lot being destroyed here on the Russia side, but we did have 3 special equipment knocked out overnight. No anti-aircraft warfare systems today, but we did have 2 multiple launch rocket systems, 10 artillery systems, pretty low numbers. Last week we were starting to see these creeping back up once we got to like Friday, Saturday. They were going up to like 30 or 40, which is an average number, but recently over the past few weeks, very low numbers here, only 10 today. 2 tanks and 1 AFV, so small numbers there. Same with vehicles and fuel tanks, very low numbers. And then troop losses back to their average numbers of 8 to 900, which we've been seeing for months now. But just prior to like a week ago, we were seeing a lot of like 1,100, 1,200 numbers, but going back to their average numbers of 8 to 900 today. So guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in for today's update on December 8th, 2025. Hope you all have a wonderful day out there. Enjoy your Monday. Let me know what you think about all these details down below in the comment section. That's going to be it for today's update. If you got something out of this, please smash that like button. Also, if you enjoy my content, please consider subscribing down below. Hit the notification bell. That way YouTube can notify you. And with that, hope you all have a great day. Everybody take care and God bless. And we'll see you in the next one.